Interim Director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the historic homes of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt and Franklin's mother, Sarah. Just a little bit of history. Sarah built these twin townhouses in 1907 and gave number 49, that side, to Eleanor and Franklin as a wedding gift. This was home base for the Roosevelts until they moved to the White House. This is the place they raised their children, where Franklin recovered from polio in 1921, ran for governor from here in 1928, and made his first address to the nation on November 9th, 1932, on NBC radio on the second floor parlor on that side. So if you haven't been up there, go up and stand there by the fireplace and feel a sense of history. Following Sarah's death, the homes came to Hunter and were used as an interfaith center until they closed in disrepair in 1994. And thanks to the vision and determination of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb, the houses were renovated 3 years ago and now host Hunter's Public Policy Institute. The Institute offers two undergraduate programs, one in domestic public policy and the other in international human rights and international justice. It also offers a robust series of lectures, conferences, and discussions of important domestic and international issues. And, very importantly, it supports faculty research. Tonight, we gather with a distinguished panel of authors and scholars to discuss a really important issue: the effects of New York City's open enrollment policies on disadvantaged students. This is the topic of a forthcoming paper co-authored by members of the Research Alliance for New York City Schools, and I confess I'm the chair of the Alliance, and New York University's Institute for Education and Social Policy. The Research Alliance conducts independent research on what's working and what is not in New York City schools, and it seeks to make solid evidence, often based on longitudinal studies, available to policymakers and the public to improve the discourse about education as well as the policies itself. Now, tonight's event is very special in another way. It is sponsored by the CUNY Institute for Education Policy, a new nonpartisan center that will focus on major issues and challenges confronting our nation's public education system. The Institute, which is headed by David Steiner, whom you'll hear from in a moment, is based at Roosevelt House and will have its formal launch conference in May. But I think this is, David, the first public event of this new institute, so you were all present at the creation. When fully developed, the Institute will provide a place for policymakers, scholars, and educators to exchange initiatives and proposals, build an important research base for those debating nationally important education issues, and help turn good theory into good practice. The Institute also promises to offer visiting lectures, faculty seminars, print and online publications that address a wide range of topics, including the effectiveness of past and present school accountability measures, No Child Left Behind, for example, the latest developments in teacher and administrative assessment techniques, alternatives to public schools such as charter and faith-based schools, as well as voucher programs, and recent research on child-centered learning models and differentiated instruction. It will also look at models for effective schools from other countries, and I think that's really important. This is not just looking at New York, not just looking at the U.S., but it is really looking at education in global perspective. At a time of growing education inequality, both within the U.S. and between the U.S. and the rest of the world, the Institute's mission, therefore, is more important than ever. And I'm sure that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt would be pleased that the CUNY Institute for Education Policy and Roosevelt House are collaborating to reverse the growing inequality in education. And here, Franklin's words before the National Education Association in the summer of 1938. And just imagine this conceals a beautiful picture of Franklin and Eleanor, so they are looking through the screen down on all of us. But just imagine these words, 1938. There is probably a wider divergence today in the standard of education between the richest communities and the poorest communities than there was 100 years ago. And it is therefore our immediate task to seek to close that gap, not in any way by decreasing the facilities of the richer communities, but by extending aid to those less fortunate. We all know that if we do not close this gap, it will continue to widen. For the best brains in the poor communities will either have no chance to develop or will migrate to those places where their ability will stand a better chance. Think of that, 1938. He understood. And with those prescient words in mind, let me now introduce David Steiner, who will set the stage for the rest of our discussion. David Steiner received his BA and MA degrees at Balliol College, Oxford, before earning a PhD in political science at Harvard. He has chaired the Boston University Education Policy Department, served as director of the National Endowment for the Arts, the education department there, was commissioner of education for the state of New York, and has really done it all. Much of his work is focused on the preparation of teachers, a critical path to improving education in our country. And as commissioner here in New York, he led our state's successful application for Secretary Duncan's Race to the Top competition that brought, listen to this, $700 million to New York to implement a wide range of education reforms, including professional development and curricular design support for Common Core standards adoption, and a full redesign of teacher certification in New York to put more emphasis on clinical training. Hunter is extremely fortunate to have him as Dean of our School of Education and also Director of this exciting new institute. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Steiner.
Thank you, Jonathan, and a very, very good evening to all of you. Welcome to this really remarkable first occasion of an institute that was simply an idea some months ago until the Board of Trustees, under the leadership of Chancellor Matt Goldstein, made this a reality. This is at once a very exciting moment for education policymakers, teachers, principals, district leaders, parents, and a very troubling one. It's exciting because there's attention, as perhaps there never has been before, on the performance of every aspect of our educational endeavor, and there are some really exciting ideas that are percolating to the surface. At the same time, we've become even more conscious of the tragically stubborn performance gaps between different groups of our own population, deeply aware that those gaps have ever-increasing impact on lifetime possibilities for our fellow citizens, worried rightly about the impact of zip code on educational destiny, and concerned that we don't seem to be able to make a real difference in those gaps despite all of our policy churning and our educational dollars. It is because of those gaps and because of the challenge to create an education for each of our citizens that will enable them not only to lead lives as productive citizens, but as human beings fully fulfilled to their potential, that the Institute takes up its role. Our vision for this Institute is to cut through some of the often deafening white noise, the rhetoric that too often constitutes the educational reform dialogue of the day. We hope and intend to be nonpartisan, to listen carefully, to bring forward data and other forms of argument. Above all else, we take up the challenge that was given to us by the great theorist Hannah Arendt when she remarked that educators have no option, no choice, but to take responsibility for the portrait of the world they will bring to the next generation. That responsibility is both humbling and exciting. It's a responsibility that we hope this institute will take a small role in trying to meet. We will offer, as Jonathan kindly said, a wide variety of programming. Our website goes live now and has already content on it, thanks to my colleague Peter Mayer, who is joining us this evening. We will make this a richer and richer document. We will be having symposium, discussions, research findings. We will invite visiting scholars to join us. We will build up and out our resources to serve this city and this nation. We will, in our dreams, become a place where you leave your swords at the door, roll your sleeves up, and actually get to work on ideas that can make a difference for students. That is the key vision for our institute. This spring, May 9th to be exact, the Institute will celebrate an official launch, if you will, with a major conference engaging leaders from national, state, district, nonprofit levels. We already have commitments from folks who are right at the cutting edge of making policy happen, but we will not make it an easy or comfortable ride for them when they are here. We will be probing with real questions and real challenges. Tonight, however, we are absolutely delighted, thanks in large part to Jonathan's introductions, to have this opportunity to serve as co-sponsors for the discussion of new research. This is the first time this research has been shared with the public from the Research Alliance for New York City Schools on a topic of great importance to our city. We are especially pleased to work with the Research Alliance since it shares our commitment to a fully independent approach to research using the best possible evidence. In a moment, I'll ask the co-author of that research, Laurie Nathanson, to present it, followed by our panel discussion. But first, let me record my gratitude to those who've made tonight possible. I mentioned the Chancellor, Matt Goldstein. Jonathan mentioned our President, Jennifer Rabb from Hunter, who, with Jonathan, made this spectacular space available and a home for the Institute from now on. In addition to Jennifer and Jonathan, Faye Rosenfeld and her staff here at Roosevelt House have been just extraordinary in making us welcome and preparing for this occasion. Jim Kemple and Tom Gold are with us in the front row here from the Research Alliance, and I'm just delighted to welcome them as colleagues for this launch. My own team is modest in number, but dauntless in energy. Peter Mayer, who's at the back, our program manager, Daniel Reed, my chief of staff, who is currently doing 3 jobs at once, and Lily Rabb, our event planner. My thanks to you all. It's now my great pleasure to call on Laurie Nathanson, a research associate at the Research Alliance for New York City Schools, to present her research. Laurie.
Well, thank you so much for that kind welcome, and thank you to the CUNY Institute for Education Policy and the Roosevelt House for welcoming us here tonight. I'm really excited to present these preliminary findings from work with my co-authors Elizabeth Baker-Smith and Sean Corcoran, and Christy's here tonight, but Sean is not. The Research Alliance is excited to release the report in January, but to share these preliminary findings with you this evening. In addition to those acknowledgements, there were many people who collaborated on this work, including our funders, the New York Community Trust. So many thanks to all the people who have helped with this ongoing project. So I'm going to move kind of fast. I have 20 minutes, and I'd like to present a lot. First, I want to set the stage and talk about the scope of the study, what it does, what it doesn't, give a little background about the rationales for school choice that motivated this study, and then develop a common understanding of high school choice in New York City. There are people from many different fields, and it's important for the findings that we have to understand kind of some of the aspects of the choice system. And then we'd like to share some of the preliminary findings, their highlights. And it includes that academically at-risk students have different preferences for high school choice. The admissions methods and criteria that different schools have, they have different choices from the rest of their higher achieving peers. And then at-risk students, their first choice schools are generally lower performing than their higher achieving peers' first choice schools. And that carries through to their matched schools. So not everyone's matched to their first choice, but on a whole, the matched schools are lower performing than the schools that all students, at risk or not, prefer. But there are still gaps between the matched schools at-risk students receive and the matched schools that their peers receive. But backing up from those findings, I'd like to talk a little bit about the scope of this study. So the goal of the study is to provide a snapshot of the high schools, the choices, and the schools where they are placed for academically at-risk students. And we were focusing on the lowest performing students from the time when they're in 7th grade and using ELA and math test scores to define them. And how we look at the choices and placements, we look at some school characteristics, like school type. So there are a lot of different schools in New York that students can choose from. Some of them don't have a lot of selection criteria. Some of them do use things like academic performance. And then we delve deeper than just the typology of high schools and look at different characteristics, including academic performance, the peer composition and location. And so the full report goes into more of these. I'm going to focus more on the academic performance of high schools tonight. And although this is a descriptive report and cannot establish causal links, we feel by peeling back these layers and slicing the data in different ways, it's revealing some similarities and differences in the way academically at-risk students experience the high school choice system, and it's also revealing some potential reasons. So some of the underlying rationales for school choice are around equity and efficiency. And really, the motivation for this study is focusing on the equity for low-performing students. So by focusing on this population, we really understand what happens when these students experience this choice system in New York. And then high school choice in New York. This is a very complicated diagram. I don't expect you to read it. I plan to walk you through the key steps in the main process, but it's a long process. It begins in the summer of 8th grade or even before then, and carries through. Choices are made in December, matching is made in February, and then not everyone is matched. The majority of students are matched through this process, but then there's a supplementary round, and there's other appeals and over-the-counter students for latecomers. But let's just focus on the main round and how it starts with the Directory of New York City Public High Schools. It is like a phone book. There are lots of choices. There are about 700 different high school programs, and this is a common starting place for students and their families. It's available online. It's available in different translations. And one of the first things that students and their families need to do is understand the different types of high schools and the different choices. So there are these 6 main types: screened, audition, educational option. And these schools have different admission criteria and priorities. And there's 3 basic categories: geography, performance, and demonstrated interest, which is signing up for an open house or putting your name down for a school at a high school fair. And what you'll notice is that there are some schools that use performance criteria, which may include the same tests that we're using to define our sample, which is something important to keep in mind, but also things like auditions and portfolios. And then there is a set of schools that don't use performance criteria, that is blind to students' performance in the selection, the admission criteria and priorities. So you might want to get a sense of what's in that big book. This is kind of a landscape of the types of high schools. And so it starts from the top, the test schools. Those are the specialized schools that you need to take an exam, their exam schools. And we're not really going to talk about them tonight, but it's a parallel system to the high school choice system I'm talking about tonight. And then there are a number of screen schools, audition schools. And what you may notice for these school offerings over time is that the educational option programs, which have 3 categories of students, they take part of their population from the highest performing students, part from the lowest performing, and then the 68% from the middle performing students. So those are schools that have mixed ability. They're selecting to create that kind of environment. And the number of educational options schools have decreased over time. You can see that's kind of narrowing. But then limited unscreened, which are schools that don't use academic records as part of the admissions criteria, they have increased in numbers. And that includes the small schools that you may be familiar with, the MDRC study about small schools that replace some of the larger comprehensive high schools. And then there's a small number of unscreened and zone schools that don't make up a huge proportion of the choices available. But the types of high schools available over time, the increase in limited unscreened and the decrease in educational option has implications for our findings. So I hope you can keep this in mind. So as students get to know schools, one of the ways they do that is by attending high school choice fairs. And schools set up, it's like a science fair. Schools set up booths, they have students, they have teachers, they have administrators, and rising ninth graders, any age middle schoolers and their families, their guidance counselors, their teachers may attend these fairs to learn more about the schools. And this is one of the places that, if you recall, the limited unscreened schools demonstrated interest is one of the criteria they use. This is where you can put your name on a sheet and then get that priority status for that school. That's how one way that students can show interest in a school. Schools use different criteria depending on their admissions method, but no school can use the students' ranking in their decision. And so students are submitting their 12 choices, up to 12 choices, and schools are submitting their list depending on their admissions criteria. But that doesn't include, they don't know what the students are ranking them. And it goes through this matching algorithm that Alvin Roth was one of the developers and recently won a Nobel Prize in economics for this matching algorithm. And it's during this process that the majority of high school students are matched, 70 to 85%. And then comes match round. So all this information goes in from students, from schools, goes through this algorithm, and students are notified of the school to which they were matched. And what's different in this system to previous systems is that students receive just one match. In prior systems, students may have received many offers, and other students none. And there is one exception. If students applied to specialized high schools and it got accepted, they would have their specialized school and also their main round match. So you may wonder, how many students were matched to their first choice? Students are ranking up to 12 choices. The majority of students get their first choice, and then up to about 3/4 of students get one of their first 3 choices. An additional 15% receive one of their other choices up to 12, and then there are students who don't get matched in this round and go to a supplemental round. But looking at this, we thought that looking at students' first choices would be a really interesting way to understand how the academically at-risk students are experiencing the system. And although receiving one's first choice is a desirable outcome, it's not necessarily always a positive outcome, so we wanted to delve deeper and understand more about the schools that students are choosing. So I hope now we have a common set of knowledge about high school choice enough to move on to some of our preliminary findings. But you might be wondering, I'm talking about at-risk students, what exactly do I mean? So we defined at-risk students by the lowest performing students on their tests in 7th grade. And we looked at students who scored in the bottom 20th percentile on at least one of the exams, if not both, but not above the 50th percentile. So these are really students who are struggling on both English and math tests. And then we took a look and saw, like, are these students actually different than other students? And they did have significantly worse outcomes than their higher achieving peers. And just to give you a sense, we're looking at the period from 2007 to 2011, and there are about 75,000 students who met this definition. And these students pass fewer Regents exams by 10th grade than their higher achieving peers. They're more likely to be in the system as having formally dropped out, and they're less likely to graduate on time in 4 years. So this is a different population, and understanding how they're navigating the system is important. So what else do we know about these students? They are more heavily male than the rest of the population. They are also more likely to be Hispanic or Black, and they are more likely to have free or reduced price lunch. So not only is this sample not doing well on tests, it's also, they have other risk factors and that includes English language learner status and special education. So this is a group of 100 of these academically at-risk students, and more than 51% of them are ELL students, the medium kind of purple. They are ELL and special ed, have both of those risk factors, or they are special ed students. So in the full report, we look more in detail at these subgroups, but just so you understand the makeup of these groups. But still, half of these students are neither special ed or English language learners, and they still are scoring poorly on these tests and part of our at-risk sample. So now we get to the good stuff, the findings. One thing that we found is that the admissions methods influence students' choices and matches. And what we saw is that although at-risk students and their higher achieving peers receive their first choice at the same rate, about 50%, a closer look reveals that there are some differences in the choices that they're making. And at-risk students are more likely than their higher achieving peers to choose a non-selective school, to rank a non-selective school first. And even when at-risk students choose a selective school first, they're less likely to get that as their first choice. So let me show you how we came to this. So first, this is the match rate. So looking at first choices, it's about 53% for both groups. Similar for second choice, similar for third choice. As you get into main round choices, there's some small differences. There are more at-risk students who wind up in the supplemental round. But for the most part, 76% of students are receiving one of their top 3 choices. That's not different for these at-risk students. A closer look at their first choices shows you, the purple pie chart represents at-risk students, that at-risk students are about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 choosing mixed schools like education option schools, academically selective schools like audition schools, or non-selective schools like limited unscreened. But the green pie chart for their higher achieving peers shows that they have a strong preference for the academically selective schools. So more of these students are applying to screen schools and audition schools. And then even when students, at-risk students, ranked a selective school first, they were half as likely to get that as their first choice. So if you look at the first bar, the purple bar, about 23% of at-risk students received a screen school as their first, if they ranked that first, but twice as many of the other group received that, and the same for audition. So those are 2 types of selective schools. And then you look at education option schools. So that's they're choosing students in like each of the 3 buckets: low performing, middle performing, high performing. And our at-risk students, 62% of those students, if they put an ed op school first, they're more likely than their higher achieving peers to get matched to that type of school. They're about equal on limited unscreened. That's where it's there's no academic criteria. Unscreened schools and zone schools, you remember those are a small percentage of schools. The trend reversed itself for unscreened schools, and at-risk students are actually more likely to get into those schools. So although students are getting their first choice at the same rate, when you look at the types of choices, they're different, and then when you look at the rates within each of these school types, there are some differences here. Our second finding is when we look deeper at first choices beyond school types, and we looked at some characteristics. Academically at-risk students' first choice schools were on average lower performing than the first choice schools of their higher achieving peers. And some of the indicators that we looked at were progress report scores. And these are, we think, good indicators of a school's quality, and they're adjusted for peer composition. And if you look at at-risk students, the purple bar, about their first choice schools on average have about a score of 60, whereas first choice schools for their high achieving peers have about a 64.5. This trend continues and is actually more pronounced for graduation rates. So the average first choice school for at-risk students has a 68% graduation rate, whereas their higher achieving peers prefer schools with about a 78%. So there's about a 10-point gap there. At-risk students, their average school only graduates 68 out of 100, whereas their higher achieving peers have a better chance of graduating with average rates of 78%. The trend continues for attendance, which is another proxy for performance, but the gap isn't quite as pronounced there. And those are averages, so that looks at the average first choice school for both groups. We broke it down to look at progress report grades. So whatever arguments you have about what the progress report does, and people have a general understanding that an A is better than a B, and a B is better than a C. And so when you look at this, you see this pattern where at-risk students, their first choice school is less likely to be an A or a B school, and more likely to be a C or a D school than their counterparts. So they're making different choices, and we don't know, this doesn't tell us if students are looking at these grades as they're making their choices, but after they make their choices and we look at it, this is something that we see. And then finally, bringing in matched schools. So whether you're an at-risk student or you're part of their higher achieving peer population, on average, students are assigned to a school that is lower performing and more disadvantaged than the one they ranked first. And then the differences that we saw in the first choice schools, that at-risk students were choosing schools that were on average lower achieving, that carries through for their matched schools. And we go back to the same chart with progress report, graduation, and attendance, and you see the same pattern where the purple bars are lower and the green bars are higher. So on average, the progress report scores are a little bit lower for at-risk students, matched schools, and a little bit higher for their higher achieving peers. And then lots of bars. We brought back in the lighter colors, the light purple and the light green represent the first choices for at-risk and their higher achieving peers, and the darker colors represent their matched schools. So not only do you see the gaps between the at-risk students, the purple bars, and the higher achieving students, the green bars, but you see the gap between their first choice school and their matched school. And so the pattern is the same, the gaps are the same. What's happening in students' first choices is carrying through, but also a little, for everyone, their match schools are a little bit, on average, lower performing. So this is a summary highlighted findings, and we were thinking about what are the policy implications of these findings? What is this, so what does this matter? And one thing that we want to learn more about is there an information gap, or is there an opportunity gap? What is contributing to the different choices that at-risk students are making? Do they need more information about school performance? Do they need more schools that are close by or that they think they can get into? And also the gap between first choice schools and matched schools, that's on average all students are matched to schools that are lower performing, has implications for choice and the supply. So the more good choices there are, the more choice can matter for these students. And finally, one of the principles or one of the rationales for choice is about match. So does this enable students to find a better match and understanding more about what match or fit means above and beyond what the quality of school is in terms of progress report scores or graduation rate is something that we would like to explore. And I hope that although I moved quickly, the findings that I shared tonight will launch an interesting and engaging conversation, and I look forward to hearing responses.
I'd like to invite the panel members to join me. So first, thank you so much, Laurie. I'm not going to say a lot about our panelists because there are bios in your programs, and you're very, very much invited to read them and enjoy them. What I am going to say is simply to introduce the colleagues on the dais with their official titles. So on my immediate right is Clara Hempel, the Senior Editor of Center for New York City Affairs and InsideSchools.org and the New School for Social Research. On my immediate left, Robert Sanft, the Chief Executive Officer, Office of Student Enrollment, New York City Department of Education. In other words, this is the gentleman responsible for everything you just saw. And on my far left is Joe Vitoridi, my wonderful colleague, the Thomas Hunter Professor of Public Policy and Chair of our Urban Affairs and Planning Department at Hunter College. What I would like to ask our three guests to do is speak for 5 minutes or so each in response to the paper. Then I'm going to have Laurie have a chance to respond to the responses, and then take us through another round of discussion, and if we have time, and I think we will, open it up for some questions from the floor. So why don't we start with you?
You're not going to start with Joe.
No, I'm going to leave Joe to.
I'm happy to go first or last.
My perspective is as a parent, and I started, and as a journalist, and I started looking at the schools when I was pregnant with my second child, who is now going off to college. So I know the schools from that perspective, and there's an implied criticism of the system of school choice in this research, and I've been a longtime critic of the New York City public school system bureaucracy, as Rob knows. But I also want to point out that Mayor Bloomberg did not inherit a perfectly equitable functioning school system and go about to wreck it. There were deep inequities before, there were deep inequities with the system of zone schools, and I think that the creation of the small schools has actually been one of the great triumphs in the past 10 years. That as inequitable and complicated as the system is, and I agree with you completely on that, there's no doubt that the small schools on average are better than the very large schools that they replaced, at the very least in terms of safety, in terms of graduation rates. So that said, I think that there's a stratification of the school system which is sort of astonishing. A principal in Washington Heights, a middle school principal, asked me the other day to help her kids with the high school choice application. And I set about to do a list of some schools that 8th graders in Washington Heights might be interested in. And I made a list, and I discovered that there's one school if your child has grades above 90. There's another school if your child has grades above 85. There's 3 of them if your child has grades, this is 7th grade grades, above 80. And another if the child is above 75. And if your child has 70 above, there's another. And then there's the limited unscreened, which don't. So that there's a stratification, not just by low, middle, and high, but by very finely defined grade point averages in 7th grade, which is really young, to be dividing kids up. And that one of the problems with this stratification is that the at-risk kids tend to end up on the bottom of the system. I just want to point out also that the stratification is not necessarily good for the kids at the very top, because there are kids who get into a Stuyvesant or a Beacon or a very demanding school, and they find they just can't do 5 hours of homework a night. And at that point, they're stuck because the system is very rigid about transferring. And if they were in an ordinary neighborhood high school in New Jersey, they would be able to drop a couple of honors courses and take ordinary courses. One of the guidance counselors that I spoke to in a high poverty middle school, who I think is very good, recommended for his kids that were at risk that they go to the educational option schools, which tend to be a little bit larger than the very small schools. And they tend to have a wider range of abilities within the class. So if the kid that didn't do so well in 7th grade ends up in an educational option program, if he gets his act together in 9th and 10th grade, at least he has a higher range of possibilities. He can take pre-calculus, he can take chemistry and physics, whereas the smaller schools, the limited unscreened schools that the at-risk kids tend to wind up at may not have the more advanced classes.
Joe.
Okay.
Nice.
As Laurie said, this is really a study of how at-risk students fared in the high school choice program. I think one of the major findings that she has is that both at-risk and the stronger students got most of them got one of their top 3 choices, which I think is very good news. And it's a higher percentage than used to happen before. I think one of the interesting things that she found was that the kinds of factors that people looked at involved not only academic performance of schools, but proximity, safety, familiarity, and I'll come back to those. The major finding, I guess, I don't want to over-repeat it, but that stronger students were more likely to choose more competitive schools, and conversely, at-risk students were more likely to choose lower performing schools. I don't think the outcome here is surprising or unusual. I think the history of American education shows that, there's a pattern. There are patterns that of low and high performance that reinforce and replicate themselves all the way through the educational process, starting from the early grades where, and I think if we were to extend this study to college, you'll see the same thing, that the better students are applying to more competitive schools and doing better. Of course, the disappointing thing about the study is that choice did not alter the pattern when it came to the lowest performing schools. And there are some conclusions that are drawn from that I think are slightly overstated. It sort of suggests that choice may not be the most viable option for low-performing students and their families. There's a suggestion that the kinds of students that wind up being at-risk, which are mostly disproportionately minority and poor, are not really prepared to negotiate a serious choice regimen. There's also and so I'd like to look at some of the data more closely. My own reading of this is a little more positive. And I would suggest that the at-risk students and their parents made some very logical, rational choices when you look at it more closely. 30% of these who are at the lowest level of performance by 9th grade applied to the most select schools possible. That's impressive, I think. And a lot of them, disproportionate number of them, applied to smaller schools, which I believe, and I think Claire would agree with me on this, have smaller schools are much better prepared to deal with students who have, and give them more personal attention than larger schools are. So at-risk students, it's a very logical thing to do that. I would think that the parents of these two schools also know or assume that their children are less likely to be admitted to the most competitive schools. And the data here bears that out. And if they get admitted, given the lack of good preparation, there's a good chance they won't do well in those schools. So what I'm suggesting here is that the decisions made by these, what I would consider probably mostly low-income parents or disproportionately low-income parents, is not as irrational as it may seem. I think if you really want to explore the impact of the choice programs, you're going to have to go further than that 26% of the students who are in the 26th percentile of the lowest. I think you'd have to do, I'd like to, if I were going to do a further study, one of the things I would do is look at these schools in terms of larger proportions. I would like to see the next 20% of low performers. I would like to see the next 20%. I would say that if you looked at the 80% of the lowest performers in the 9th grade, you'll still be dealing with a population who is not getting a decent education. And if you find that the second quartile or third quartile is benefiting from choice and finding their way into better high schools, then there's something to talk about with regard to choice. I would question, and I would like to see how that plays out, because my own hunch is, we call it a hypothesis if we want to sound like researchers, is that those students in the next 20% or the 20% after that are probably going to be more aggressive, more confident, more likely to benefit from being at a school and do well in a school that's more competitive. And the results could be quite different. I would also suggest that looking at issues like safety, in addition to academic performance, is not unreasonable for those kids who tend to cluster in these low-performing schools and who live in areas that are very threatened. Safety is a very important consideration, and if you have to send your child to a school where they're at risk physically, that's something you got to think about. Am I running out of time? Okay.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for leaving your swords at the door, by the way. So I think that there's a lot to respond to here, obviously, between the research and the comments. I sat at a panel, I don't know how long ago, that some of you attended, and I notice a few of you here tonight. And basically what I said is that choice is obviously not a solution, right? Choice is a mechanism, one in an arsenal to try and work on school quality and improve student outcomes. I would be interested to see this research done pre the movement towards a full choice system in the same manner that it has been done for the several years between 2007 and 2011. I apologize, I'm not speaking into the microphone even though it tells me to do so right here. I don't follow instructions very well. Mostly because before we moved towards a full choice system, these statistics didn't actually play out the same way that they did. We had students applying for schools, and the stratification was remarkably different than it is today, as Clara alluded to. There were students that wound up with multiple options to attend school, and then there was a universe that wound up with absolutely nothing who had to simply be placed. And where were they placed? They were placed in their neighborhood schools. So if you play out the universe of kids who take part in the choice process every year, which is roughly 75 or 80,000 students annually, literally before we implemented the choice process, 50,000 kids wound up with one or more choices, and 30,000 of them wound up with nothing. So at the end of this process, you are finding that there are students who are getting a preference. Speaking to the quality of those preferences, speaking to the graduation rates of those preferences, that's the next evolution of all of this work, right? We look at our portfolio of schools, and I want to be clear, there's a difference between a program and a school. But we seem to be using them interchangeably here tonight, but there are students who are applying to a program within a school where the school might have 5 or 8 programs in the school, and there are students who apply to a single program that is a school. And so the considerations that parents are using, whether it's proximity, whether it's safety, whether they are new to the country and their community is an L community, all come to bear when they're making these choices. So we can't just look at it as if there's a group of students who only apply to this universe of schools because they are academically selective, and this universe of schools because they might be the path of least resistance. So I think we need to be cognizant that the DOE has been working for several years on a strategy. Some people agree with the strategy, some people do not. I'm not here to debate the strategy tonight, of looking at our lowest performing schools and transforming them and turning them into places where we can open schools that are smaller, that have proven out to be successful largely. There are some that have not. And that these are places where communities are applying to school. These same communities where there are concentrations of at-risk students now have places where there are one or more programs that those families are happy to send their kids, whereas previously they might be frightened to send their children there, but had no other option. And so all of these different factors come to bear when they're making their decisions. I think that we have a lot of work to do. The portfolio of schools strategy and looking at how we change that portfolio is important, but the next phase of the work is looking at the program portfolio. Whether it's single school or multiple programs within those schools, we need to figure out what programs are needed locally, what programs need to be replicated because they're highly successful or they're high demand, and we need to figure out what programs need to close because they're unsuccessful and nobody wants to send their children to them. So as we're looking at all of this research and we're looking at the difference between one group of students and another group of students, we really do need to factor in all of the different considerations that families are making.
So, Laurie, if I can summarize briefly, I think we have one view that says, look, the results aren't very surprising. In fact, they're quite encouraging because the first choice ratios are the same, that it's a rational actor who says, my child, for whatever reason, is not performing at a very high academic level and therefore is unlikely to be taken by a high-performing academic school, and therefore why waste the choice, and therefore naturally is less likely to select that school as a first choice, but there's more choice than there ever was. And another view which says we're in a Bourdieuian sense, we're reproducing social inequality, that the choice mechanism is fundamentally failing to break down a continual reproduction of the inequalities in the system. How would you respond?
So I think the first thing is that we looked at a narrow set of qualities of schools and presented an even narrower set. So I would agree that looking at different aspects of schools, these aren't necessarily the things that students and their families are using to choose schools. They may not rate graduation rates first and progress report grades second. They may rate proximity first or where a sibling went. So there's so many factors in here. This is trying to look at some of these factors that we think are important and describing the differences. And then as far as reproducing the stratification, I think Rob's point that this study doesn't look at what the school composition before looked like, so we can't really answer whether this is better or worse. It's still a problem, but it was a problem before, and this study doesn't address whether it's better or worse. And then I think an important point is that school type, these selective or non-selective schools, are not synonymous with quality. As Clara pointed out, the small schools, those are limited on-screen schools. They're non-selective schools. Some of them are performing very well. So as we peel back these layers, the school type is one thing that we can describe the choices and the matches. But then it's a very different thing to look at progress reports, to look at graduation rates. And the presentation here tonight didn't look at safety. It didn't look at all these other things that are important to the school experience.
So let me change the discussion a little bit. Let's assume the worst. Let's say that what this study shows is that the choice mechanism, while arguably better than what came before, part of a package of other reforms, is not making a fundamental dent in altering the inequalities that we all talk of and that we rightly worry about. What would be the practical answer? And let me put it at an extreme level. The logical response, if you really wanted to toss out the existing system of choice and change it, would be to do a kind of academic affirmative action, right? Would be to insist that every choice that one could make was made irrespective of the school's right to say no to you because you weren't academically strong. Right now, rational choice says, I'm not applying, I'm a very poor student academically. I'm not going to apply to a top school because I know I'm likely to get turned down. So should we institute affirmative action academically and simply say to schools that they don't have a right to say no to weaker academic students?
So I think we didn't look, but we would like to look more in depth of the ed op schools. So those are the schools that select students in each of the performance categories. So those schools are purposefully stratified and having students of all abilities. So I think there can be some clues to how that's working, and then looking at, so is an EdOpt school a good school? Well, I think if we look at some of these characteristics and try to understand the variation in those EdOpt schools and look more carefully at which students are applying and then who winds up there and what's happening. And one point, just backing up, I think the comparative framework that we used, like jumping into comparing at-risk students to the rest of the population, is somewhat problematic for the discussion. Just looking at descriptively the choices of the at-risk students first, some of the points that Joe raised, in these students are applying to selective schools. There are a good number of them who are applying to selective schools and getting in. They're getting in at lower rates, but there are some students going there. And by looking at the averages, it's not telling the full story. If we follow that population of at-risk students who's applying to and getting into screen schools, that might be telling us a different story. So this is like a very general, high-level story. I think there's lots of storylines and paths to pursue.
Clara, I'd like to push you on this question of solutions.
I mean, actually, we tried that before too, right? I mean, the educational option programs were started about 30 years ago.
Right.
The idea being that innovative new programs wouldn't be allowed to skim the cream.
Exactly.
And places like Edward R. Murrow in Brooklyn and Beacon in Manhattan and Baruch and Benjamin Banneker, Baruch in Manhattan and Benjamin Banneker in Brooklyn were designed so that they would have what you called affirmative action. That is, the kids would be assigned by computer. And if you Googled Susan Brenna from New York Magazine about 10 years ago, and there was a long article about how unfair that was, because the hardworking kids who showed up every day and who did all their homework were getting sent to rotten schools, while the delinquents who didn't do their work were getting all the good spots. Subsequently, those schools most of them are no longer educational option, they're now selective. I mean, the problem is, as long as you have only 10 schools that anybody wants to go to, and you have 20,000 applicants of all of those schools, there's going to be a problem. And what we posted on our web, on Inside Schools yesterday, was a list of good schools that you haven't heard of. Mm-hmm. The hope being that, you can't all get into the 10 schools that everyone wants to go to. Here are some that are, that you haven't heard of. So that's our little way of doing it. I mean, the other thing I want to disabuse is the notion that 13-year-olds are rational actors. I mean, I don't know how many of you have children, I mean, my daughter, when we went through this, she picked a school, and I said, "Why did you like it?" And she said, "Because it has red lockers." And I said, I'm not going to say, I'm like, yes, the red lockers are very nice, but you have to come up with a better reason than that. And you come up with kids who are, I want a football team, so I'm going to go from Manhattan to the Bronx to a school that's dangerous because they have a football team.
Right. One interesting thing to explore, actually, is who's the decider, the parent or the child, and that's not something we got into.
Yeah.
Not to say that parents are always rational actors. Joe.
I think your case illustrates that the parent is the actor, because you said the red lockers are fine, but you're going to go somewhere else, right? So
She ended up at the school with the red lockers.
well, then you're both irrational. Okay. Look, the answer to this, there are two sides to choice. There's a demand side, which we've been focusing on, and there's a supply side. And as you said, Clara, and you implied, if you don't deal with the fact that you don't have high-performing schools to select, then choice isn't going to work, nor is anything else going to work. And, the fact of the matter is, I think it's very good that you're closing failing schools. I think it's very good that you're experimenting with smaller schools and other kind of innovations. The fact of the matter is, the situation is not good. 82% of the kids that come out of New York City schools and go to community college in New York City need remediation. They're the graduates. And so it's a very bad situation. And that's what we got to deal with. At that point, then choice could be used as a way to pair people with preferences, to pair people with priorities. But choice alone is not going to solve the problem if we don't deal with the supply side.
So I think a couple of things. I think I want to talk a little bit about expectations and a little bit about time. building successful schools, launching successful schools and programs is not something that materializes overnight. And I think we all know that it takes a lot of time for those schools to become successful, for their leadership to develop, for their pedagogy to develop. And frankly, the solution of perhaps implementing EdOpt across the board would evolve quite differently than consistently being EdOpt across the board, as Clara hinted at, because depending on the leadership, depending on the nature of the program, the theme of the program, you'll see the demand swing, and the nature of the applicant pool that will move towards one program versus another will start to shift what that program looks like. And over time, some will move towards a more selective status, and others will move towards a less high-performing status, perhaps, and then ultimately we'll have a different set of considerations to make. If you look at the EdOpt programs the way that they work now, very few wind up with this perfect bell curve percentage of applicants. And frankly, I don't know if you're aware of the nuance of it. The EdOpt program in and of itself is somewhat screened, as the slide actually hinted at. The schools get to select 50% of the applicants from that bell curve, and 50% get randomed in. So if the bell curve is not there, then the kids materializing in the program are not representative of that curve. That said, I think that ultimately we have parents who want schools immediately, high-quality schools, absolutely, schools with red blockers, and unfortunately, it takes time to create all of those good schools.
Scoring peers who end up at low-performing schools.
So I think there is a lot of research ongoing at the department, but I would highlight one specific reform that we're undertaking right now, which is to change the paradigm for our students with disabilities. And whether there are folks in the audience on one side who believe that we're moving too quickly, folks who believe we're moving too slowly, this, I believe, is the type of work that will allow us to start to look more deeply at how students with disabilities who attend certain schools wind up in a different performance level than some of their peers. Do I think we're there yet? No, I don't think we have the opportunity, based on the way students with disabilities have been served historically, to look across the spectrum of our programs, across the schools and the classes as they previously existed, to say these kids perform in the same way as those kids, but ultimately the nature of the programs were completely different. I think this will give us the opportunity to start looking at that.
As you take the school system as it now is, right, I think no one on this panel would argue, no one, that we are near where we need to be in terms of having choice for high-quality schools only. That's 10, 20, 50 years of hard work. But what about the choice mechanism would you like to change now, given the current situation, given where we are with the schools we have?
Oh, I mean, it's just so complicated, you know? Yeah.
So you'd simplify it?
Yeah, no, I'd simplify it. But, I mean, I think school choice allows motivated kids to escape terrible neighborhood schools in poor neighborhoods. But it does nothing to improve those schools. And I think so is it good for kids to escape terrible neighborhood schools? Sure, you know. Does it fix the problem? No, and I don't think Rob disagrees with me on that, you know. You asked whether the department's doing research. I mean, there's national research that I can't quote, but maybe one of the academics can, that suggests that one of the reasons that poor white kids do better than poor black kids is that poor white kids tend to be in schools that are economically integrated, and that poor black kids I see Susan nodding, thank you, and poor black kids tend to be in schools with high concentrations of other poor black kids. And so that economic integration is something, you know, that we can work for. I'm actually hopeful in the city as a whole, because the neighborhoods are becoming more integrated than they were. And that there's the potential for the first time ever, I think, to have integrated neighborhood schools. So I would strengthen the neighborhood schools without dismantling the system of school choice. And I think the way you strengthen the schools is good principals, hire good principals and let them hire good teachers.
you planning any changes in the choice mechanism?
Well, I mean, I could tell you, but I think Clara is familiar with some of the things that we've done over the last several years to change the program, to increase the amount of information that we're providing. I will step back and say, we can always do more, and we have to do more. We get that. It's the reason I am in this role, in this work. There is a lot to do. My kids go to public school. I went to public school. I have a vested interest in seeing our schools be successful and our students be successful. We have, over the last several years, transformed the high school directory. Yes, it is still a telephone book. However, I think Clara would agree that it is cleaner and clearer in the way that it delivers information. We have brought to bear more data in that book than we had when we first launched the process. We started with the progress report grades and some of the other accountability metrics. We moved towards adding the graduation rates, and now we are we're adding the college enrollment rates to the books. And so the more information we can supply, the better, but obviously we have to teach people how to use that information. Just one point. When we added the progress report grades, we didn't see any remarkable swing in the way that people applied to schools. But when we added the graduation rates 2 years ago, there was a tremendous swing in the way that people applied to schools.
Interesting. I'd like
But,
to...
but that creates more problems because you just have more and more kids piling up and asking for the schools with the high graduation rates. I mean, the more efficient the markets are.
It's a good
Yeah.
problem to have, though,
Yeah.
to have people looking at schools that are performing well and doing well rather than being uninformed and applying elsewhere, which I think is part of what's coming forth from this research.
But the at-risk kids who are still going to end up at the schools with the lower graduation rates.
Disproportionate.
Just, I mean, I'm not against information, and I think you have done a great job of giving out information, and what I do every day is try to give out information. I'm not against it. But what I'm saying is that the more efficient the markets, the more information available, the more you're going to have frustration of the people who are trying to apply to the schools that they can't get into.
Let me open this up to the audience. It's the usual plea, but I mean it. Please, a question. Just a question. And please keep them brief so we can hear from a number of people. Yes. There are mics coming around.
Yeah.
And if you wouldn't mind your name and any affiliation.
Sure. My name is Heather Hanneman. Hi, I'm a teacher, a high school teacher.
Thank you.
So since you guys are talking about the schools right now, I think it's an interesting question. What would you say about the impact on schools that have to market themselves? Because we don't get a budget, per se, for marketing ourselves, but we now have to engage in that task in order to attract students and communicate effectively what our school is about. So
Great.
what might you guys say about
Great.
that?
A model question.
I like the way I keep getting pointed to for all of these things.
It's your system.
Nobody
Do you want me
else?
to take it, Rob?
No, that's fine. I think that there is a base level of marketing that we provide for each of the schools and for their programs. There are several schools that choose to, yes, invest some dollars in furthering that marketing, others that do not. There are others that have a long-standing opinion that they do not need to market themselves, that they will do well without marketing. I do think it's an issue in a time of scarce resources that we do need to try and figure out how to, at the same time we are leveling the playing fields for our families and students, that we need to do same for schools. I would be happy to start to work on ways that we could help schools with their recruitment efforts. It's something that we have done sporadically with schools, but I think we need to do more of it as an office.
Great. Next question should go to the panelists who are not named Robert. Anyone? Yes. Mike is coming.
Hi, I'm Michelle Costa. So I think that the graph, when it showed the distribution of types of schools and that the zone schools are going down and very, very low, I think that was a little misleading in some ways just because of the way priority is given to districts, and many schools fill up with their first priority district, so effectively they're still zone schools. I know it's not supposed to be just for Rob, but this is kind of a broad question again.
I'd like
But
to point
whomever,
out that she
if
works
Laurie,
at the DOE.
not supposed to throw me under the bus like that. Right? But Laurie might be able to address it well. Just addressing like how schools are able to choose who they get to select and how that affects kind of the choice process.
Right, so the broad types of schools, there's variation within a limited unscreened and how they weight geography, right? If they have one borough or two boroughs that are in their top priority versus more, a neighborhood or there's different criteria within those broad types. And so I haven't looked at that systematically, the variation within limited unscreened schools, like how different schools use geography, or they pretty consistently use the demonstrated interests. That's pretty well spelled out of open houses or high school fairs. So I don't have an answer to, what that looks like, but that goes to, I think, Heather's question about high schools marketing. So high schools can be strategic about how they use those criteria to be more selective without checking another box.
Just for information for the audience, do individual schools get to select their own criteria for admission?
I have to defer to Rob.
Hi, I'll take that one.
That's the same,
It really depends on the school and the nature of its location and whether or not it's a replacement or it's in a standalone building. If we are intending to serve a particular community, then we will steer the school in a particular direction in terms of a geographic priority. But ultimately, we would like to have schools that can compete citywide, but there are a host of issues, geographic isolation, transportation corridors that all play a role in whether or not a school should have.
So there can be a
priority.
constrained choice on the part of the school.
Correct.
Yes,
I
Joe.
think there's an obvious policy response to this. I mean, one of the things that's clear when you look at the data is that students, parents, families like to see the students attend schools in their own neighborhood. I don't think I need much of an explanation on why that happens. So when you're thinking of developing more competitive schools, it has to be a real effort to place these better schools. Maybe more competitive is not the right word, more attractive. In areas where there's a dense population of students who are failing. And you can map it out. You did. I mean, there are neighborhoods that have a disproportionate number of failing kids and failing schools. So you've got to put resources and good alternatives in those places, because another thing that cues people is familiarity. And if the school is down the block, they're more likely to know about it. There's no way of getting away from the fact that you're going to have a telephone book of choices when you have a system with 700 different programs. And so geographic proximity and targeting geographic areas has to be a very important part of the strategy, I think.
Got it. Other questions? Yes. We'll cut to you.
Hi, this is for Lori, or about the research. I'm Carolyn Satin-Bajaj. So I, like Joe, was not that surprised, but in some ways heartened to see that so many at-risk students applied to EdApp, which I would think is their best shot at getting into a slightly higher performing school. So I'd be interested if you could disaggregate the data in a way to see if there are trends in what middle schools they're coming from for those, and the higher performing limited unscreened. So I don't think that they're rational actors, but something interesting is happening. Are they being steered by, in my research, guidance counselors would say to some of the lower performing kids, or the highest performing, rank in EdApt 1, because if you're in the top 2%, you're gonna get in, that's a guarantee. Or if you're a really bad student, you have no shot. You're lucky if you have a 70, because at least there's a chance to getting into the 70 or above schools, but if the students who had 65. So can you identify, is this a way to then say, okay, how is it working? Because as much as the DOE provides more information, if it's not personalized at the student level, at the middle school level, it's not gonna get to these kids who can't understand how to differentiate. So anyway, question, suggestion, comment.
Yeah, in the report, we do some work with distance and location, and that's a great suggestion to look at feeder schools too, like what the concentration of these at-risk kids in feeder schools, and then what does that look like when they go to high school? Is the overlay of the map the same? or is it different? And then, yeah, I think there's a lot more work to do with looking at certain school types, looking at boroughs, and I mean, I think there are so many students, there are so many programs, there are so many stories, and trying to get at some more of these nuanced patterns.
Oh, right here, front.
Hi, my name is Caitlin. I'm a student here at Hunter. I know your study didn't specifically deal with the specialized high schools, but given the recent lawsuit brought against the DOE regarding diversity at the specialized high schools in New York City, I'd really love to hear the panelists' thought about the SHSAT, diversity at specialized high schools, and possible alternatives.
Trust the Hunter student.
Gee, thanks.
I'm kind of glad he
What was
passed
the
me.
question again? It's, I guess, we need to find ways to allow those schools to be more receptive to students who aren't at the very top. Because what you have is a situation where you have 10 seats that 25 people could fill very well. So you don't necessarily have to choose at the top. But I think you have to do that very carefully, because I don't think you should lower the standards. I think one of the things that those schools do is they provide an opportunity for students that looks at academic performance only and gives them an opportunity for a world-class education at no cost. And that's important. And so, you know, there are better ways to do what we do, but I don't think we should lose track of having schools that are selective and excel at that level.
Could I jump in on that? I mean, it's a very complex and difficult thing to deal with, to change. I think I've discovered. I met a Vietnamese mother, you know, who moved from Syracuse to Brooklyn so that her child could take the specialized exam. And among a lot of Asian immigrant communities, there's the test prep starts in 3rd grade. And people, they're really drawing on a national pool of parents who care so much about Stuyvesant that they move to New York. I had an intern who's a Korean ancestry, whose parents who said, if you don't get into Stuyvesant, we're selling the house. She got into Stuyvesant, you know. But so there's a culture, and these kids are working really hard, and to say they don't deserve the seats in the schools is not fair. The other thing is that a lot of but where are the really bright African-American kids? And a lot of the really bright African-American kids are being snapped up by Dalton or Exeter or the boarding schools. And so that, or Regis is another, I met somebody who went to Regis today, just now. And there are, so that it's going to be a very complicated thing to unravel. There are some very demanding high schools like Bard Early College High School, which don't use an exam, that use essays and interviews, and they have a higher proportion of African-American kids. And there are some of the specialized schools like Brooklyn Tech and Brooklyn Latin, which do have a high percentage of African-American and Latino kids.
One more question? Right, I think that person had their hand up at one time.
Yes, this is a question about the research, and I'm curious if you looked at the other end of the spectrum, if affluent students are consistently getting the schools that they prefer. I'm curious if you looked at sorting at the other end of the socioeconomic scale.
So we were using test scores to group kids, and what that means is that this group that we're looking at doesn't necessarily include kids who are coming from private schools. So I think Claire just pointed out that for specialized schools, students are coming from not just New York City, but students are coming not just from New York City public schools as well. So it doesn't include private school students who I presume are on the higher end of the spectrum for SES. Yeah, I think moving the research forward, if we continue with this type of framework, looking at the highest achieving kids and the patterns, I think is an interesting comparison. I think Joe brought that up, looking at slicing like performance in kind of finer grain rather than the lowest 20% and all others.
I would stress this is a work in progress. It's a work in progress not only because it's a new choice program, but because you're at the early stage of trying to deal with the supply side. And so I think if you're going to use research to inform policy, then I think you have to look at cohorts of students. I'm going to stress that again. Because my expectation will be that there'll be a lot of students who are being denied a decent education now, who are at a different cohort, who could benefit from choice sooner. And that may be the way you have to do it. But I think you need to have this information. If you're going to let information guide policy, then that's the way you have to design the research, I think. You have to look at cohorts of students.
I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for sharing the findings with us. I want to remind the audience that the slides that you showed will be available on the website as of now. So by all means, take a look. I imagine you would receive questions and, thoughts and feedback. Look, this is a really brave thing to do, which is to share research before it's published, to open it up to discussion and critique, and it's exactly the kind of risk that we encourage and that we hope to support with the Institute. So everyone on the panel and to the audience, thank you so much.